Hello. Hello. Let me know if you can see me. I should be live. I hope I'm live. Welcome back. I am back home. I am once again capable of live streaming, and I am really glad to be here and to be back to this. We'll see how this goes because I've changed what I'm live streaming with, because I used to live stream just with my StreamYard or YouTube or whatever, and now I've actually started using OBS Studio, so we'll see how that works as a stream. So I hope you guys are looking forward to this. My thought with today's live stream was to, and just if somebody could confirm that, you know, the sound is coming through and that you can hear me okay and that you can see me and all of those things are working, that would be great. Because it would suck if you couldn't hear me. So my thought with today's live stream was to talk about the illusion of power versus the reality, and what that means for not constructing your magic systems, but constructing the societies around your magic systems, the wizards and so on, like the actual mage societies. And what got me thinking about it was actually the political events of the last 5 years or so. So ever since Russia invaded Ukraine. And the reason why it got me thinking on that on that topic was just that when the war started, when Russia went into Ukraine, I don't know about anybody else, but I certainly thought that Russia was going to steamroll them. I mean, I knew kind of at the back of my head that Russia was no longer sort of the Soviet Union and all the rest of that. But, I thought that Ukraine was a fairly small nation. Russia outnumbered them by a lot to a lot. I think it's 3-1, and yet Ukraine did stop them, and they stopped them before the West jumped in with any aid or whatever. That column that was marching on Kiev, nobody in the West could help Ukraine at that point. So it was all kind of Ukraine at that point. And it broke the image of Russia as this mighty army. But I don't know about anywhere else in the world, but certainly in Finland, we had a lot of jokes floating around, like Russia went from having the second best army in the world to having the second best army in Ukraine. And then when there was that dude who, tried to coup, and he marched his mercenaries towards Moscow and then chickened out at the last minute and so on. So then the joke got this added tail of like Russia went from having the second best army in the world to the second best in Ukraine to the second best in Russia. And it was just such because they failed to dominate the battlefield, it was such a loss of that image in your mind of this powerful state that it created a very different image in people's heads. And I thought about it again in 2025 and 2026 with two events. So the first was when the United States went into Venezuela and they took Maduro out, and they grabbed Maduro and took him back to the United States. Whatever you think of the politics of the action, and I happen to think that it's not the world's cleverest plan, the actual military execution was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. And I think it actually increased the United States military prestige worldwide, because it was just like, it was in, it was out, and they were done. They had the guy. Through all of the defenses, through everything. It was incredible. But then there was the invasion or the action in the Middle East with Iran. And while the first few days of strikes were impressive, the more that conflict dragged on, the more the prestige meter kind of went down, because of Iran's endurance. And yes, they could be bombed, but they couldn't be forced into regime change, because they had, all of these additional they had institutions and backups and so on. And it kind of drained some of that prestige out of the United States Army, because as mighty as they are, they can't make this country of 80 million people whose economy has been kind of bludgeoned for the past 20 years. And I am not carrying water for the Iranian regime. Do not misunderstand me here. I do not like the Iranian government, and if there is an actual revolution inside Iran, I will cheer them endlessly. They did resist this onslaught, and that kind of upped their prestige and brought down that aggressive power. So now, if we move away from kind of the geopolitical take on that, and think about the world of a fantasy world, right? And if you think of kind of military power in this context as magic power, right? Let's say that it's an actual magic power that allows you to dominate other people in some way, right? It allows you to blow through their defenses, or force them to do something, or work for you, or whatever the case is. Is it the power that you hold that is what gives you the power to act? Or is it what people think you can do? And as long as they think you can do it, it is in fact more powerful. Because the problem is, the one way that I guess Russia could end the conflict in Ukraine is by resorting to nuclear weapons. But once they do that, they lose, because everybody loses, because there's just too much risk in a nuclear war, right? And it's the same situation in Iran. So you have these weapons that in theory could end the conflict, but they're too risky to use, because they can just ignite the whole world in a conflagration, because you don't have a total monopoly on them. And I was sitting with that idea and thinking about, because I've always said that majors should run the government, right? If you have majors that have got powerful battle magic, it just makes sense that they would end up in dominance hierarchies, unless controlled. They would end up in dominance hierarchies with a mage at the top, right? Because they have the power to bend reality to meet their needs. But in the last 5 years, I've been wondering if it's not actually more the power that you don't use that could keep you at the top. right? And whether you don't run a risk with your powerful sorcerer if he then lets loose, and it is not as bad as people think. And it is not as devastating as people think. Like, will he still retain his power? And it was such an interesting thought to go down. Like, what would happen to a mage if he is in this position where he's fireballed somebody once, right? So he dropped a sun on somebody or whatever, and he's now become kind of the emperor of the world, and everybody fears his power, right? But there are people who've been kind of making plans to resist, having a sun dropped on them. And as long as the mage doesn't use his power, everybody's like, no, you have to be afraid of the mage, because he could drop the sun on you. And we have seen him drop a sun on people. So you have to fear this mage. And then somebody kind of like, and it's all fine until the mage decides to actually try it again, and this time it doesn't work the same way, because people have learned to adapt, because they've put in place, defenses, or they've built up some kind of armor or something like that. Like, it would just be so interesting. So Saint Sir Nicholas, I've basically just gotten started, and it is great to see everybody again, just as a heads up. So I was saying that I was thinking about conflicts over the past while, and kind of like how much prestige Russia lost by going into Ukraine and not completing their goals, right? And how that, like we used to have these jokes, or we still do, I guess, but they're kind of old now in Finland, of like Russia went from being the second best army in the world to being the second best army in Ukraine. And I was thinking about like that application of like what happens if the mage's power is no longer what it was, right? So if it has this illusion of power, and everybody's afraid of the mage, as long as they don't use their power. So when I say drop the sun, do you mean a literal star or something like a constellation of the dragon spell? So I mean like, like in any kind of very devastating spell. So it could be like literally drop a star, although then I hope you're playing in space, because we're talking like, destruction of planets. But any kind of super destructive spell. I mean, you can even look at the Star Wars trilogy, right? The Empire uses its Death Star, right? And it blows up a planet, and it is devastating. But it blows up that one planet, and maybe it would have worked. Of course, then the Death Star got blown up, so, But it's an interesting thought what happens if you have this, or you have this reputation, and then the petal hits the metal, and suddenly that reputation is not what it was, and like how that can transform your world, Yes, when Wagner revolted, we had those same jokes here. It was like Russia went from having the second best army in the world to the second best army in Ukraine to the second best army in Russia when Wagner revolted. But it was an interesting exploration of, like in my head anyway, this whole thing was a very interesting exploration in the exercise of power, the reality of the exercise of power versus the versus the kind of the illusion that you maintain by not exercising power, but by saying, I have this power. So I have the power to drop a sun on you, right? I have the power to drop this immense spell on your head. But I'm not gonna, as long as you do what I want you to do. And in a way, that is actually more powerful than continuously dropping a sun on people's heads. Right? Like continuously using the spell. Because if you continuously use the spell, you might force people into doing it, but you maintain them in a continuous state of fear. And fear isn't that useful as an emotion. Whereas holding the power back and saying, I could do this, but I won't, creates a more compliant subservient population. And it was very interesting. And it also got me thinking, the other thing it got me thinking about is the monopolizability of weapons and how big a difference that makes in setting up your magic system and the power structures in your world. So, like, Russia could, if Russia still has nuclear weapons, which I'm not 100% sure they do because they're very expensive to maintain and they might not have maintained them, but regardless, let's assume that they have them or that they can make them. So if Russia fired a nuke, they could end the war, right? But because it is not a weapon they fully monopolize, it will also result in kind of, or the risk is that it will ignite a full-blown nuclear war and kind of end the whole of civilization. So the cost of using that one is too high, right? Especially when you're not existentially threatened. And while Putin is existentially threatened, it's not that he's so threatened that I think that he's at the nuclear war stage. And if he had a full monopoly on nuclear weapons, like he was the only one with a nuclear weapon, I think it would be different, because if you are the only one with a weapon, then you fully dominate the world. Right? So if you are the only mage and you keep control of all other mages, nobody else becomes a mage without your permission, then you do hold that full unillusionary power. But if you have multiple centers of mages, it's kind of like I said in my geopolitics video, right? You're going to end up with like nation states competing for mages in order to hold this power against each other, almost like they hold nukes. And so all you'd need is one mage who doesn't want to be part of the cabal, and suddenly you no longer have a monopolizable weapon. And now it becomes a situation of, do you dare to use the full extent of your power? And if you don't dare to use it, then it's no longer a weapon. It's just a deterrent. Right? It's a deterrent to anybody else using that particular weapon rather than an actual usable weapon, which also changes your approach to how you would wield your power as a mage in that kind of situation. So, yeah, exactly. The way in World War II, the United States could drop nukes on Japan because they had a total monopoly on nuclear weapons. They were the only country with nuclear weapons at that point. Even though like France and Britain had been involved in the process of nuclear weapons and in theory could make them, there were only 2 nukes in the world, and I think there were 3, but otherwise they were very limited and they were all controlled by the United States, so they were It was a completely monopolizable weapon. But then Russia developed them, and then China developed them, and now we have North Korea, and Israel and South Africa developed them together, and so because it is no longer a monopolizable weapon, it can't be used in the same way. So yeah, it's just like, it's interesting to think of that in terms of like what the result is with magic when that happens. So if we also think of like George R. R. Martin's story, right? Yeah, so I'm not Gary. I'm not throwing stones at anybody for dropping. I'm not here to litigate the geopolitical decisions. I would not want to be in the position where I have to make a decision about whether it is moral to drop a bomb or not. Like, these are not, I'm not throwing stones here. I'm just talking about it more from a perspective of like the effect that it has on the geopolitical status of nations, and how you can translate that to fantasy power structures, and kind of like what it means for a mage to use their power or not use their power. So like in Naruto, where they put the 9-tailed beasts between 9 great villages in order to create balance, and that's exactly what happens when you create non-monopolizable weapons. It creates a if everybody has it, nobody has it kind of effect, right? Not that nobody has it, but that nobody can use it in the same way because of the if one uses it, then it can touch off all these other issues. It was just. It's also in part because of the book I'm reading, which is the Goliath's Curse, right, by Kemp, which he talks about, early states formed because of monopolizable weapons, and because they could restrict people's movements, and because of the crop types that they could grow, right? So if they could grow lootable crops. And once, the problem with those states were they didn't form everywhere, right? Not everywhere became non-egalitarian states with elites at the top and kind of everybody else, farming below them. But once the states started forming, then they spread. Like the idea, the concept of the state spread to the point where it kind of took over the world, and there's almost nowhere left where people live without a state, right? And it was very interesting to me that those are the necessary attributes of creating a state. Is this monopolizable weapon thing? Because it got me thinking about, okay, but what happens in a magic world, right? What if magic is restricted to a certain bloodline? Obviously that creates ideal state conditions. But even if it's just knowledge, like anybody can learn to be a mage, right? Sure. Okay, so everybody can learn to be a mage, but the first one who does is going to become a secretive dude. The first dude who learns to be a mage is going to become super freaking secretive and hold on to his knowledge, because as long as he holds on to his knowledge, it's a weaponizable, it's a monopolizable weapon that he can use to create a state with. At least the first one who learns it and is ambitious in that way. Because, to be fair, not all people are ambitious in that way where they will create a state. Okay, most of us are not. Most of us are happily like cooperative people who want to work together with other people. But we do unfortunately have people who are not like that. and they unfortunately, kind of queer the pitch for everybody else. So yeah, I don't know. It was these were interesting thoughts that Louis Kemp's novel has been putting through my head. Louis Kemp's novel, and I've got a video coming out on Tuesday about slavery. Oh, the algorithm is not going to love me, but anyway. So I made a video about slavery and versus serfdom, and how they're not the same thing and so on. And it got me researching like the ancient origins of slavery and all the rest of that, which is also tied into kind of like the formation of the first states, because it was labor couldn't run, they couldn't easily leave, and they were scarce, and land was abundant, and that creates kind of conditions where you start getting coercive labor and so on. So it was very interesting. I hope you all enjoy that video. Saint Sir Nicholas says, what if the first wizard is a communist and wants to share ownership of the means of arcane production? Well, so that is interesting, right? One of the things that Kemp brings up is that, might mispronounce this name, Catalhoyuk, which I think it's the second oldest city that we found, right? It's in Turkey, and it's like ancient as all heck. People stayed there for like 7,000 years and eventually abandoned it. But from the archaeological record that we can find of that settlement, it looks like at the beginning they didn't have elites. Okay, they all just lived together in this fairly big city, and they were all fairly egalitarian, and they worked their land together, and they all kind of banded together for defense. And it looks like what happened, and this is all a very long time ago. It's inference from what we see in the archaeological record. It is not 100% fact, so don't take me wrong here, right? But the inference seems to be that elites started rising in Catalhoyuk, and as the elites rose, people abandoned the city. They left the city. So I think it could be that you might have somebody who wants to cooperatively spread magic and cooperatively spreads magic, and then you would have a much more kind of egalitarian approach, and multiple people would have magic. Would dominance hierarchy still arise? Maybe. I don't know. It would depend a little bit on your magic. So Gary, slaves were cheap labor, yes, but it's not just cheap labor that creates the conditions for slavery. What creates the conditions for slavery is when labor is scarce and other resources are abundant. Because if you have lots of resources available, then people would actually just work for themselves, right? Because they could take land for themselves and they could work on their own land. So you need, if you're an elite, like not you, I mean, if you're one of these elite people who likes dominance hierarchies because you're at the top, then you need to force them to work your land because it's more profitable for them to go work their own land. And that's kind of what creates the conditions for slavery. It's what created the conditions for slavery in ancient Egypt, in Rome, even in the transatlantic slave trade, because there was way less people in America. There was lots and lots of resources, and so but you had to bring labor across the transatlantic. So it's very interesting, because I also thought that slavery was just about cheap labor, but it actually is not just about cheap labor. It is about the abundance of resources versus the lack of labor, and crucially the ability to restrict people's movement, right? Because if people can run away from slavery, you can't keep them, okay? But if you can restrict them because of your geography, or because of your gods or your legions, or because you've taken them away from their home, and they're in a foreign land where they don't speak the language and have no cultural roots, then it's very hard. It's very hard to keep them to use mass slavery. So, yeah, it's just I went very deep into the slavery thing. I read like so many freaking treatises on it. It was a very interesting, a very dark exploration, but a very interesting exploration. Skiffy says, you're randomly born with magic talent, then any commoner could in theory go invisible and kill the king or something. Oh, what precautions would you take as the king? So, yeah, absolutely, I would have wizard gods. I would have wizard gods, I would have elite gods, I would have my king would be guarded out the wazoo with with magic, because that would be your only defense, right? If everybody has magic, right? If commoners can learn magic, if non-elites can learn magic, then your elites have to be either magic themselves, or they have to have access to magic. So they have to have magic items, as Karsart just said, or they have to have wizard gods or something like that to keep their person safe. Animals are great. They're an interesting example. So I don't know. What do you guys think of my crazy idea and my bananas kind of thoughts around geopolitics and how you apply that to magic, and the power that you have but don't use versus the power that you actually use, and kind of the problems with using that power, right? Because that was actually what really got me thinking about this, was like, if you use this immense magical power and you fail, you're pooched. Like, there's no coming back from that, at least not immediately, because you've lost that ability to hold that power over people's heads, which I think is, one of the things we see play out kind of in real time. A diviner, Saint Sir Nicholas, like future magic is such an interesting thing. Like anything time related, anything future related is such an interesting magical ability, because if you can see any appreciable amount into the future, and it's true, like even minutes into the future, it creates a fascinating situation where how are you taken off guard? How do you fool a future vision? Gary, the power is blackmail, and that blackmail is actually a great example as well. Like, what happens if you blackmail somebody and you're blackmailing them and you're blackmailing them, and then they're like, actually, it's not it's not going to be all that in a bag of chips, you know. So I'm okay. Like, you let that out, then you lose. Like, the blackmailing only works while you don't use it, right? So it's an interesting thought process. Like, powers that only really work when you don't use them. And if you do use them, they better really do what's advertised on the box, because otherwise you've lost all ability to use them. You know, then they just don't matter anymore. So, yeah, I mean, it's it's interesting thoughts. And other than that, I've recently reread Ursula Le Guin, so that was nice. She's an interesting read, because it's always such a deep, like, I always get something else, something new out of her books, something thematic out of her books. And yeah, I'm working on revolutions at the moment, because I'm building a revolution into my world for the new series. So I'm doing a lot of work on revolutions. Free Ren was such a great anime. I really, really enjoyed that anime. It was such a great exploration of all kinds of aspects. You know, the setup of the immortal elf, like the whole setup of the show, the fact that you start after they've defeated the demon and everybody else, and Free Ren wants to like keep going and adventuring and having fun, and everybody else is like, no, I'm old and I'm going home. It was a great anime. I really enjoyed that. So thoroughly enjoyed it. So, yeah, thoughts, guys? Do you have questions? I'm here for the first time in freaking 2 months. So hit me with your questions. The problem with gold or other metals as currency, since it's detectable or even creatable with magic. So, currency and magic creates an interesting situation if your magic can create currency out of thin air. And I think that what would inevitably happen is, okay, so let's divide this into two things. On the one side, there is your currency can create money. On the other side, there is your currency can create food. Okay, your currency can create Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If your magic can literally meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're dealing with a completely different beast. Because at that point, people don't need anything except a mage who can create their food, clean their water, and maybe help them construct a house. And that changes the kind of whole equation of creating a civilization. Okay, so that's one side of the discussion, and we can talk about that and talk about what kind of models like would come out of that. The other side is they can create metals, or they can shape, maybe not create metals because that also creates problems, but they can shape metals into currency, right? So they can create convincing fakes. I think that they can create convincing fakes would just result in the same kind of combating of fake coins that we've always seen. So there'll be some kind of like a mage will figure out how to build in some kind of seal that proves the currency, or there'll be some kind of, maybe there's a spell that proves its legitimacy or something. And there will be mages who can crack it and mages who can't, and so on. That would be my thought process with the creation of currency as by mages. I would think that it would just be the same as our fraud detection. I don't have my wallet close here, but like the European Union notes, the EU notes, have got like all kinds of anti-fraud stuff built into them, and this is a 5-cent coin, like the mold edges of the coin is about preventing fraud with money and all of those kinds of things. So I think you would have the development of all of that kind of anti-fraud stuff way earlier. Yeah. Yes. If you have magical creation and it's flawed in some way, that creates a very interesting story. Department of Magical Coin Printing is pretty much exactly what I think would happen. Yes. So you'd have the coins tied to something to detect its validity. I think that would be the only way you'd go, or you'd use a metal that magic can't, manipulate, or something like that. There'd be some way of detecting actual currency versus not actual currency. Although I will say, if you are doing the majority of your transactions in actual metal coins, like physical metal coins, it doesn't really matter if people are faking it that much, because it's more about the weight of the metal, right? It's still tied into the value of the commodity. It's only later when you really split away from the commodity pricing and you really hit the like symbolic pricing, and you start using completely different means of payment, like us and our fiat currencies and so on. To an extent, now I say that, see, I'm always a this way but also that way, because nothing in life is that simple and clean. Because even like gold and silver and whatever, they're worth something because we say they're worth something. They're not inherently worth jack shit, like gold isn't that useful as a metal. It's not actually that there's no reason for it to be so valuable. It's so valuable because we say it's so valuable, and so we treat it like it's so valuable, and we all believe it's so valuable, and so it is so valuable. So it is in its way also a fiat currency. It's just a fiat currency with a little bit more weight behind it, than the purely fiat currency that is printable by the issuing authority and unconnected from any kind of commodity or GDP or anything. I mean, you can print in theory infinite money, though of course that has other effects on the economic system, and it's complicated. I have an amazing book on my to-do list, on my to-read list, called The Untethered Central Banker, which they make such an interesting argument about the past 40 years with high growth and low interest rate, where they were like, basically all of this growth and whatever was not the result of like anybody's economic policy. it was the result of two completely unrepeatable events. The first being the integration of women into the labor force, which basically doubled the labor force, right? And we can't do that again because we don't have that untapped labor force. And secondly, the integration of China into the world manufacturing and the outsourcing of inflation to China to their low-cost labor force. And we can't do that again either because there is not another China waiting to, be the low-cost manufacturer. So they basically argue like we've come to the end of free money, basically. And it sucks to be us, I guess, is what it is. Anyway, sorry, I know this is not an economics channel. I won't keep on the economics. I just find it interesting. What school of magic do you like to use and not use in your worlds? I tend to not. What I tend to do with my magic is I tend to have like a single kind of source magic, like a reason why there is magic in the world and kind of like the place where power comes from. And then I will have each culture manipulate magic in slightly different ways. So in the Empire of Sangwheel, the Empire of Lumiaron, mages learn a single ability, a single domain from a spirit, right? And that is the only domain of magic that they can use. So they'll learn how to use light, or they'll learn how to use shadows, or they'll learn how to, so it's these very, very singular abilities that they learn. And once they've learned it, like, that is all they can use, right? So there's these specific channels of power burnt into their heads. Then in Kisangi, they do it differently. They don't have specific domains that they learn or whatever. Instead, they pray, and their prayers are essentially spells. And they channel what they call the power of the gods, which is kind of the power of the gods, but it is also just the ambient power of magic. And then further to the south, you have the Empire of Imoven, where they have mages who use a more kind of formal ritual magic to create spells with like ruins and so on. So that's kind of my approach, is I do this, this culture by culture different manipulations of the kind of central theme of magic. Yeah, so if people can materialize metals out of air, the thing is, if people can materialize things out of air, like they can absolutely create something out of nothing, or out of air, or transmutation, or whatever, like it puts you into an almost post-scarcity economy. With all of the post-scarcity economy, like you have to think of it as a post-scarcity economy at that point. Like if this change is real, if I create a bread right now and I can eat this bread right now and it gives me sustenance, right? Then I exist in a world where I do not need to regulate scarce resources, because there is now an abundance of resources. And that's basically what post-scarcity means, right? It means that you no longer need any kind of allocation of resources. You don't need a market-based allocation of resources. You don't need a command-based allocation of resources. You don't need any, because you now have so many resources that everybody can just have what they need. There's no need to regulate. And that changes your everything about your world. It changes your culture. So that's always my thoughts around, as soon as you can create things with magic, like as soon as you can create, especially like if you can meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs with magic, the world changes. Okay? The world changes so dramatically. Because the reason why we have markets or command economies, like either one of the two, is just to regulate scarce resources, right? It's about the allocation of who gets what resources, what gets made, because what gets made requires us to allocate resources. So, yeah, yeah. So it's that's always my thought process around it. Yes, The Slithering Shadow. Also, the culture novels by Ian M. Banks. The culture itself is a post-scarcity economy. Star Trek explores post-scarcity economy to some extent with the little machine they have that creates everything you need. So it's an interesting setup because it breaks our economic models, right? So you have to really you have to think through from first principles what you think would happen to a society like that. Because our economic models, be it communism, capitalism, free markets, command economies, all of them, they are all based on the principle of scarce resource allocation. So if you break scarce resource allocation, you have to create a new model. You have to think of what is the actual model in your world at this point. Like, if I created a world like that, I would probably see, the thing is, it once again comes down to monopolizable versus non-monopolizable, right? If it's monopolizable, if the magic is very, very restricted, you might end up with dominance hierarchies, with the majors, creating food for their followers, and everybody who's not their followers, well, you just get to struggle away and do agriculture on the edges of these massive magic kingdoms where the mage king provides for all, which could end up creating a very interesting Shadowrun-esque world if you think of corporations as mages. So if you work for a mage, you're part of a mage kingdom, and then your life is wonderful and perfect and awesome, and you live in a house and you have food and whatever, but you have to you have to, I don't know, sing the mage's praises daily and say how awesome he is and kiss his fundament or whatever. And there are people who are just not willing to do that, so they live on the edges of these massive mage kingdoms, and they use their own hard-won kind of agricultural skills, or they have their own mages or whatever. It could be an interesting setup to have magic kind of restricted like that. Maybe you have a whole bunch of dragons who do this, so you've got these dragon kings who create food, and they have these big kingdoms, and then you have these humans living at the edges using agriculture, which would be, it would be interesting. And if magic is abundant, so everybody can create, so there's a wizard in every village, or a wizard in every family, or whatever the case is. So you've got abundant magic. I think you end up with people pursuing other careers. I guess exploring, learning, art. And I think if it's abundant, you probably don't develop dominance hierarchies. You probably never develop a state. Because if magic is that abundant and it can meet your needs, if somebody tries to dominate, if somebody tries to create a dominance hierarchy, somebody claims to be an elite, then your people can just leave. Because they have a wizard or they are a wizard and they can make food for themselves, so they just pack up and leave the dude who was claiming to be an elite sitting alone on his little ash heap crying about being king. So, you know, it's yeah. It's interesting thoughts. It's interesting thoughts. Yes, currency is anything that is widely perceived as valuable and hard to get. It's been everything from freaking salt to you know, there's this island where they've got these Arakanui, I think. Anyway, they have these huge stones that count as currency of a sort. It's very loosely currency, but you know, so yeah, currency can be anything. It's great. Yeah, so other questions, other thoughts? Would you guys... I am very open to questions or whatever. As I say, like, it's the first time I've been live streaming in like 3 months, so it's been very, very fun. I have missed live streaming. It is a lot of fun, even if it is a little bit more chaotic than my videos. So, and it is really good to be back home, and out of the cabin in the woods. I was getting some serious cabin fever there. Okay. I don't have much else to say, so if we've run out of questions, then I hope that you all have an amazing Sunday, and I look forward to chatting with you again next month when we do another live stream. It was a pleasure, as it always is. The next live stream will probably be somewhere in June. I'm hoping to do like 1 to 2 a month. That's my kind of plan, is to do one to 2 a month, with so basically on Saturdays, one Saturday in a month, I release Worldbuilding Blueprints, right, which is the podcast. One Saturday a month, I release a compilation, and the other 2 Saturdays, I'm thinking I'll probably do a live stream. So, I think 2 a month is both doable and fun and all that. And I'll start putting up polls again to talk to say, like, what do you want to talk about and whatever. So that it's not just me waffling on about whatever non-fiction thing that I've read recently. Alright. Thanks everyone, have an amazing, amazing time, and I will speak to you again